you have a legal cannabis business in the state of New York. What is stopping a federal agency from coming in here and shutting you down? Not much. Not much. So the same logic obviously applies on the banking side, right? If I'm banking cannabis, despite the fact that it's state legal, what is stopping a federal agency from coming in here and censoring the bank, censoring me personally? And in fact, if you're familiar with what's called BSA, Bank Secrecy Act, there is in fact not just an institutional responsibility to prevent money laundering, but a person, an executive at a bank can be held personally liable, whether civilly or criminally. So in that context, why would any bank bank cannabis, right?
Welcome to How to Flourish in Cannabis. I'm your host, Brian Weber. Today's topic, cannabis banking in 2024. How to Flourish in Cannabis is an educational focused show with experienced leaders in regulated cannabis. Our guests have a wide range of experience in law, insurance, real estate, and today we have a cannabis banking expert on. No pitches here. This is designed to be a masterclass in regulated cannabis. How to Flourish in Cannabis is our effort to educate and elevate. I'm really pleased to welcome our guest today, a friend of mine for at least a few years in the industry, Peter Su. Peter, thank you for joining today.
Brian, thank you so much for having me today. I have to say I'm really impressed with the radio voice that you suddenly activated. It was amazing.
It just pops up sometimes. Yes, thank you. That's how I got the gig. Peter Su's with thank you. I appreciate it. Peter Su's with Hanover Bank. And, I wanted to have him come on and talk about this. He's been in the industry for a number of years right now, but I don't want to intro you too much, Peter. You do such a great job introducing yourself because you've been in banking for many years before cannabis. So if you don't mind giving our audience a little bit of background on where you're coming from and how you got into cannabis banking.
Sure. So I've been in banking 23, 24 years or so. I've done a variety of things, middle market, private banking, et cetera. I guess about 6 years, maybe 7 years ago or so, I got an opportunity to start a cannabis banking program. And this is now my third cannabis banking program. And actually in between, I was also a consultant for a bit. So I've worked with dozens of programs around the country. I also do some other things in the industry. I'm on the board of advisors for a company called C-Trust, which is a credit reporting for cannabis. And I'm on the advisor for the Cannabis Summit, which is a European-based cannabis conference.
Sounds very European there. I also know that you've been doing some guest lecturing as well around the area and nationally.
Yeah, to be honest, that's actually what I'm more proud of because, not to be accusatory, but as you know, it is possible to pay and play. So, you go to a conference, you see the speakers, and this is not to take anything away from anyone, but quite often that might just mean that they bought a booth or something like that, right? Whereas I'm really proud to have been asked numerous times to speak at. So I've spoken at Wake Forest, Rutgers Law, Hofstra Law, Medgar Evers, et cetera. So to me, that's actually more meaningful. That's a professor or an operator, someone that's actually out there in the industry saying, hey, I respect your opinion. Come talk to my students.
And besides you being just a great human being, that was some of the other reasons I wanted to have you on today. Because I know anytime I've had a question on cannabis banking, I get the $100 answer from you, and we can go deep as time permits. And I really appreciate that. And I wanted to have you on the show today. One, and let's just get into it right now. So cannabis banking, it is May 2024 when we're recording this. Things are very fluid in the cannabis industry and very fluid this year as we're looking forward to what changes might happen with Schedule 3, but also around Schedule 3 for the banking side. So, but before we dive into the current state of things, can you give us a few minutes of a brief background of where all these cannabis banking programs started? I mean, this industry's been around, for about 10 years now. How did we come to today?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually, because I think it sets a little bit of context, knowing that your intention is to get to actionable steps. Let's not, dwell in the history too much. That said, I think that a lot of the myths that we believe in today simply comes from history. So yes, there was a time not that long ago when it was impossible to get banking in cannabis. I kind of count myself amongst the early days, right? So when I first started a program, yeah, it was relatively rare. It was hard to find, very expensive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason for that, of course, is very simple. It's federally illegal. So you've heard numerous people talk about safe banking, safer banking, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm just waiting for safest banking.
Safest. It's an iteration. It's an evolution, right?
Safer banking.
So if you think about this, so Brian, you have a legal cannabis business in the state of New York. What is stopping a federal agency from coming in here and shutting you down?
Nothing anymore. The call memo has been rescinded. Not much, right?
Obviously applies on the banking side, right? If I'm banking cannabis, despite the fact that it's state legal, what is stopping a federal agency from coming in here and censoring the bank, censoring me personally, right? And in fact, if you're familiar with what's called BSA, Bank Secrecy Act, there is in fact a not just an institutional, responsibility to prevent money laundering. There is a personal, a person, an executive at a bank can be held personally liable, whether civilly or criminally. In that context, why would any bank, bank cannabis, right? And so to your point, co-memo. So when the Cole memo came out, FinCEN, the Financial Crime Enforcement Network, so in 2014, they released a set of guidance, cleverly named FinCEN 2014. And FinCEN 2014, believe it or not, pretty clearly spells out, hey, if you're going to bank cannabis, make sure you do this. So despite the fact that it's 10 years ago, the reality is that action was not that quick, on a practical level. So despite the fact that there was guidance from regulators, it took years before banks and credit unions started saying, okay, well, maybe we could do this, right? So again, roughly around the time when I jumped in, by then we were already seeing the market get more competitive. But yes, in the early days, you used to hear horror stories of like $10,000 a month just to have a checking account. And not only that, but it did very little, meaning it was literally just a checking account. You could put money in the bank, you could write checks.
The bare bones, first checking account you ever got as a kid. A debit card. Maybe you had to pay extra for checks, I'm sure.
Yeah. Actually, that's a good analogy, right? Like the way that you would limit a minor's account was very similar to the early days, right? Honestly, today, I think that myth, it's a myth now. A cannabis business today that wants to find banking can find banking. If you're still hearing people talk about it, there's a couple of reasons. It is harder to find. Meaning, if you just went to your big bank, your regular bank, and you said, do you take cannabis? Of course, it said no. So by and large, it's relatively small banks. And yes, it is a relatively small portion. So according to FinCEN statistics, the official statistics says 812. About 812 financial institutions in America are banking cannabis.
And are those like financial institutions, like as in a credit union, but they might have multiple branches? Like those are just the parent organizations.
That's right.
812.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, most insiders agree that number is way too high. We think it's closer to like 100, 150. If you think about that in any given market, that probably makes sense. 38 medical states, 23, 24 now adult use, right? So sure, it makes sense that means there's a handful in every given state. So the reality is, yeah, unless you happen to call one of those handful, you got to know. And then you turned around and repeated the urban legend of I can't find banking.
Yep. And then I just seen it in major media as well. So I just wanted to get out there and have a banker on to dispute that. Even an interview with Patrick Ray was on recently with, I think it was Cheddar or somebody. It might have been CNBC or Cheddar. But yeah, like you can get banking. I know several cannabis bankers. Of course, I'm in the industry. What might be some good resources for people who are looking for cannabis banking services? They can have some actionable insights right here.
Yeah, the best sort of publicly available resource might be something through PBC. PBC Conference releases a directory every year. Now, slightly double-edged, right? Like what they do, it's a self opt-in. So in other words, they find what is publicly available. So anyone that has released a statement, anyone that has been quoted in articles, but then they will ask you, like, do you want to be in a directory? Now, why would people say no? Believe it or not, that's still really common, and this, of course, feeds into the myth. In the early days, it used to be common to in one of my programs. In fact, we had clients sign NDAs.
Oh, interesting. So they couldn't even talk about it.
That sounds weird, right, Brian? We welcome your business.
Well, if you know, it's the speakeasy of cannabis banking, I guess.
Brian, we love you. We want your business. Can you sign this NDA so you so you
you
won't tell
can't
anyone that you bank
you
here?
can't talk about. I don't know how you got here. It's like Fight Club. Don't talk about Peter Sue's cannabis banking program. Okay, so that's the current state of affairs today. You can find a listing for these, at PBC, PBC's conference website. Actually, I think I got an email yesterday, May 15th, on their cannabis banking sheet. That's available for there. I'd like to go over, before we get into some more of the details of like fees and into Schedule 3, and we're going to cover those things though. Peter, one thing I know we talked about this in the prep for the show, but you've been getting a lot of questions now. It's not just banks anymore, credit unions. There's some fintech that's entering the game. So there's like 3 different types of banking organizations that are servicing the cannabis industry now. Can you give us a brief overview of them and maybe some differences and pros and cons between the 3 of them?
Yeah, good question. I get this a lot. Well, honestly, it depends a lot on your business, your needs, where you're at in your maturity, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, many myths come from somewhere. In the early days of cannabis banking, there were some crazy stuff going on. We used to have like online banks. We had some online banks that were actually clearing through offshore banks. And so you would hear these like crazy stories of like, oh, in order to deposit a check, I had to like mail it and wait a week, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right.
If you even got a check in the mail.
Yeah.
Not just a bag of cash.
So again, actionable steps. Today, honestly, there's not that much of a difference, again, depending on your need. So if you are a brand new business starting out, and by and large, and I'm making some assumptions here, you have really basic needs. You have money you want to deposit, you want to pay your employees, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is that as you compare your options, setting aside fees and capabilities for a second, not much of a difference. That's the honest truth. So where are the differences? Well, what I just said, the things that we set aside, right? Let's compare price. So capability, capacity, and cost. Those are the things that you want to compare.
Those are the 3 C's right there.
Yeah, I just made that up.
I like that. Well, I just did too. I guess proximity might be one too. Those fintechs probably don't have branches, or they would have relationships with branches, I'm assuming, to be able to supply.
Maybe. Modern day banking is sort of interesting because the reality is that most people don't, outside of cannabis, most folks don't come into branches anymore. It's actually one of those trends that have been, overstudied over the years, where retail locations, traffic is so far down that a lot of banks are actually starting to move away from retail locations at all. Or they're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Like you might have noticed, right? You walk into your average branch location, and they're just getting smaller, or they don't exist. Ironically, and I say ironically because the relationship between cannabis and banks has not been great up until now, right? But ironically, old bank locations are great dispensary locations.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because it's usually high foot traffic area, convenient to public transportation.
Vault.
Yeah, and they're also well secured. They even have their own vault, so you can keep everything.
Someone thought about security, high visibility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, so again, most banks now in cannabis will do some sort of the problem with proximity or location is cash. So most retail locations, unfortunately, suffer from a high volume cash, which I think we'll cover in a little bit, which is due to the issue with payments. So if you don't have debit cards, you don't have credit cards, you only have cash available, right? So
and lots of cash too.
A lot of cash. And we're talking, 10 plus thousands, 20 plus thousands a day. So a lot of cash. So to your point, if you can't, and you don't want to, maybe, if you can't drive, a mile, right, within reason to a branch, what's your really only option? Armored couriers. But in that sense, it actually, again, pulls the difference between the different services pretty close, because they're all solving the cash logistics the same exact way, which is armored couriers.
Yeah, and that's a real big difference right there. Any other differences in pros and cons that you want to highlight before we move on to our next topic?
Yeah, I think when you look at the fintechs, and they're perfectly fine, the one thing I would consider is how are they clearing their transactions? So a bank or a credit union is chartered, and thus they have direct access into the financial system. A fintech largely is sitting on someone's charter. So they're clearing their transaction through someone, through a bank, through a credit union, etc. I'm not suggesting there's a problem with that. My point is they are now beholden to someone else's rules. So, as an example, one of the well-known names in cannabis recently, they had to switch sponsor banks. Their sponsor bank decided to get out, and as a result of that, like next day, like imagine getting a call, Brian, I need to change. Here's your new routing number. Here's your new account number.
And having to do that for hundreds or thousands of institutions that you're banking for in a day.
Yeah, that's hard.
That's a lot. That's a lot. So, okay. So there's some good pros and cons. Really just more things to be mindful of would be like the actionable item on here is understanding, where your funds are held at, where they're cleared through, and the different types of organizations there. I know credit unions have long been, because those are state sanctioned banks. So they didn't have and forgive my ignorance on this one, and please correct me here. There wasn't as much federal issues that they had to deal with, I think was the parlance pitch for someone who's not in banking. Could you help me out with that, please?
Sort of. So credit unions can be federally chartered as well, or federally regulated. So NCUA, the National Credit Union Administration, which is essentially the FDIC for credit unions. The difference is that the NCUA, for whatever reason, has always been much more vocally supportive of banking cannabis. So actually, this goes way back to the first question about like why has banking cannabis been an issue? Well, let's say you go to your regulator, and this is happening today actually still. If I went to my regulator and I said, "Hey, Mr. Weber, can I bank cannabis?" They won't say it's okay. Believe it or not, you will not get a "it's okay," assuming that person, that agency, is federally based, right? So FDIC, OCC, etc. They will not give you an okay. They won't say it's not okay.
Although you said FinCEN issued guidance on all this stuff.
FinCEN does have a set of guidance.
10 years ago.
That's right. So I go to my regulator. I say, hey, here's my policy. I have followed FinCEN guidance. This is how I plan to address everything. I seek your opinion. I seek your approval. By and large, you will not get an okay. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of the programs out there will limit you in certain ways. So as an example, wires. So doing wires happens on the Fed. It's literally called Fed wires. So if I went to Fed wires and I said, Mr. Examiner or Miss Examiner, can I send wires for a cannabis business? They will not say that it's okay. So to more directly answer your question, the NCUA, oddly enough, has always been much more vocally supportive. So in other words, conversely, if I was a credit union, I went to my NCUA board and I said, hey, there is now cannabis in my local community. Now remember, credit unions tend to have a mandate to do a certain thing, a certain field of membership. Teachers credit union, Suffolk County credit union, et cetera, et cetera. So if there is now cannabis in Suffolk County, in Nassau County, yes. And you say, well, I'm going to support my local community. I'm adding this to my policy. Those regulators have been much more supportive of saying, great. So that's the big difference. That's the reason why you see so many more credit unions.
Thank you for demystifying that question. While we're on that point, I couldn't go by this and not. But like the actionable items for anybody watching at home, banks, credit unions, and fintechs all servicing the cannabis space right now. I kind of want to throw this one in here before we get into some typical services stuff. But I was going to say this to the end, but actually, like, I know people watching are like, how does Schedule 3 affect this? And I'm like, I know the short answer is it probably doesn't. It is still federally illegal. It does not relate to banking things. Cannabis is still, like federally illegal. There would have to be some other legislation along with this to really allow banks to have the authority to get into banking. Is that correct? Do I understand that's what I've heard on the street? I just want to make sure I ask a banker.
Sure. Schedule 3 in particular, rescheduling to a Schedule 3 is sort of fascinating because you're right. If you think about it, not much changes relative to the current situation. So the current situation is that things that kind of exist in a gray area. there's a discrepancy between federal and state law. Right, on the federal level, it's completely illegal, if you will, because it's Schedule 1. On a state level, in some cases, it's completely legal. And of course, we have a concept known as federal supremacy. That is to say, federal law trumps state law. So the Cole Memorandum, which of course has since been rescinded, in theory, right, says, well, we're acknowledging this discrepancy. We won't do anything we're deprioritizing going after state legal programs. Now, it doesn't make it legal. It basically says, okay, we won't do anything to you, right? In other words, it's a state of non-compliance, but implied non-enforcement. So again, same concept carries over into banking. So Schedule 3, medical, which means that anybody that is adult use is the same exact shade of gray. Same exact shade of gray. Medical. Can a medical operator, currently a state legal medical operator, can they exist in the federal medical framework? Well, a couple things. One, that framework doesn't currently exist, and it could be years before it exists, right? Two, if you're familiar with the FDA process, I don't know how cannabis fits into it, right? You can't create regulation around a flower, around a plant. So, yes, we have no idea.
We have no idea. So we'll have Peter, we'll have you back on once there's some clarity on all this stuff. So I guess for Stakes as is right now, the song remains the same, but everybody is very interested in paying attention and how things will change with this. But there will probably be some other guidance or language or legislation along this to allow for banking to have some stance on this, or there won't, and we'll just continue as it is.
Well, so right there is the logical, I guess, leap one would make, right? So FinCEN 2014. So in 2014, the guidance was issued because of the Cole memo. So logically, a major legislative move like a reschedule would prompt, FinCEN
2024. Yes, it's got a catchy name.
Well, now, what I think is cannot be understated is 280E. If 280E goes away, which under Schedule 3 it should, if 280E goes away, that is huge from the question of tax impact. And the reason why, from a banking and financing perspective, that is huge is because right now, even if you get into a scenario where a bank is willing to lend or credit union is willing to lend, does the cannabis business fit into your traditional underwriting box? And of course, free cash flow.
Profitability, free cash flow. Yeah. All those things that a business wants to look at. So I think this is actually a great segue. Let's get into some typical services that any one of these type of institutions would offer for this. And I know that's going to get into we're going to get into lending and a few other things when related to like the cash flow of a business. So I think the basic thing, you walk in the door, I'm a cannabis business. Here's my approval. Here's my license. Here's 1,000 bits of things of paperwork, my blood type and all these other things. I'm assuming checking accounts like the basic table stakes. So you can get a checking account for a cannabis business at any one of these, offering institutions right now. Is that correct?
Well, yes. Yeah. So I think the nuances are exactly what is separating the different options that you have today. So again, what do you want as a business owner? If your needs are relatively simple, you'll probably not have any issues. As your business matures and your needs also get more and more sophisticated, you may start to have a situation where you're going to struggle to find the right options. So really, yeah, on the fringes are the issues.
Let's go through those fringes.
Yes, your basic, and actually in this context, it might be good for you to look at the FinCEN 2014 guidance, which is a copy and paste of the Cole memo. So you can just look at the Cole memo. So yes, in the early days, there was a very literal interpretation of FinCEN 2014, which is why in the early days, people used to ask you for everything. We used to ask people for their entire license application, meaning what they supply to the state to get cannabis licensed. Now, keep in mind, I'm in New York, right? Like the early medical license operators, right? Some of those applications were 5,000 pages. So a couple of questions. How is the bank collecting 5,000 pages from you? Who's reading it? What are they doing with it? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It's before AI too, so we didn't have that. We didn't have ChatGPT to read it for
Which
us.
again is partially why there were thousands of dollars just to have an account, because you'd have to dedicate real man hours to doing all of this. Today, I think the most limitations, if we think about the most restrictive program, they're probably still sticking to a very strict interpretation of FinCEN. So, in other words, what is actually illegal? THC, the cannabis product, that is federally illegal. So if you are a business that is, conducting THC related transactions, anything that touches the product by definition, that's the only part that is illegal. Your LLC can exist, your C corp can exist. Well, whatever you're doing is technically legal until you touch THC.
In terms of services, how does that affect what you guys can offer then?
So if you're sending a wire and you're paying your landlord, in theory, that's fine. But if you're taking a wire and you're paying for supplies, well, maybe that's a problem, right? Maybe. And again, part of the problem is if you went to if you go to your regulator and say, hey, can I send this wire? They won't say it's okay. However, I think you're starting to see some banks are starting to make sophisticated treasury management tools available, right? So on the very extreme end, you've got your most basic needs. You just want to be able to put money in the bank and pay your employees, pay your bills, whatever. But by and large, that's not going to be a problem. On the exact opposite end, hey, you're a publicly traded multi-state operator. You need to move money between states. You need to wire money overseas. You have some sort of a treasury management desktop that integrates to like 5 different apps and everything like that. The extreme end of treasury management, high level, middle market, that's not available. Cards, anything that's card related is largely not available.
And by card, you mean credit card, right?
Credit cards, debit cards, anything that touches the branded networks, right? Now, some of your viewers are going to say, wait a minute, I just went to the dispensary yesterday and I swiped my debit card. Well, you almost certainly did. You are right. They're not compliant. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm aware that they exist. They are not compliant.
So none of the services that you guys are offering are going to be offering any kind of payment services outside of maybe an ACH service to be able to pay your vendors. So
Yeah, and frankly, even ACH, right? ACH, NACHA is a function of the Treasury. Can ACH exist in cannabis?
I handle payments for our company. It's the only one that hasn't been shut down forever.
That's the only one that hasn't been shut down. But it doesn't mean that it doesn't. Anyone that's like, oh, I have a letter from my regulator, which of course I'm sure you've heard. That's probably not true. That's not been my experience anyway. So again, I think anywhere in between, if you're shopping around and you're hearing that the options are very limited, like someone is like, well, no, you can't do this, you can't do that. My advice would be, well, keep shopping because I do believe that unless you're talking about really high end treasury management, lending, you've got multiple accounts across multiple states. The likelihood is your typical single state operator, even the best ones, the most well-to-do, sophisticated, with millions of dollars in the bank, they should not be having any issues with their banking on a day-to-day basis. I think today where it's a little bit lacking would be anything sort of financing related. You want to borrow money, you need to have a debt facility that's tied to your treasury management. That's still very lagging.
You had also mentioned in our prep call that, some banking, organizations will offer employee banking or loans or mortgages or those kind of items. If you're in a plant touching industry, or a plant touching business, it has been really hard for a lot of people to get mortgages and personal loans from the banking services they're at. So it's not just for the organization yourself, but it's also for the employees of the organization that they might be able to offer member banking for plant touching businesses, and even maybe a mortgage to buy a real house. Whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, you can discuss yourselves, but like to have a program to be able to offer that is rather nice for cannabis operators and their employees.
Definitely, definitely. It's still one of those pain points that pops up all the time. And honestly, some of the stories are heartbreaking, right? Someone says, oh, I had everything lined up. I was ready to buy my house. And the last second, the bank said, well, you work in cannabis. We can't do it. Or, something crazy like that. And honestly, it touches me personally. I hate hearing stories like that. But let's talk a little bit of context here. 401k, right? Literally a federal tax code. Can a federally illegal business offer its employees 401k? On paper, I think you might say no, right? You can't. How can you do that? But they exist, right? They exist. Mortgages. And I don't know what the statistic is. It's something like 75, 80% of mortgages in this country are packaged and sold to Fannie and Freddie. Fannie and Freddie are currently federal agencies. They are owned by the Treasury, right? Can you take a mortgage? If 100% of your income is, I'm a trimmer, can you take that mortgage and sell it to Fannie and Freddie? And mind you, if you read your application carefully, at one point you attested. You said, "I attest that I hereby attest that I abide by all local, municipal, federal law." You do not
You do
actually.
not.
You actually do not. You do not. Can you take that mortgage and sell it into a federal agency? And by the way, when you attested to that's probably arguably bank fraud, right? I'm not suggesting don't do it. I'm saying
I mean, there was a lot of pages. Do you read them all? I don't know.
now they
Yeah.
exist, but the question is, can you, right? So again, in the early days, that's what happened. People all of a sudden said, "Can we do this? We're not sure." So what has happened? Well, the reality is nothing has changed from a legal perspective. What has changed is honestly just passage of time. In other words, somebody tried it. Somebody said, "Well, let's package it up and see what happens."
And it just worked.
And it worked. 401ks. It just worked. They got 401ks. Even 280E, right? So obviously, it's in the news lately. Some of the bigger cannabis companies have decided to challenge 280E. Are they going to win? We don't know, but they've done it. That's all that has happened, really. Through the passage of time, people try things and it works. Will it come back? We don't really know.
This is a very ask for forgiveness, not permission kind of industry. So I'm I know you're a banker and like, some personal and ethical and moral and, purpose driven responsibilities for not, allowing any nefarious things to go through. But at the same time, like we see the real business behind here. And, these are regulated industries and, should being able to have access to this. So I think it's a matter of just one chip away at a time, seeing if things work. And great, I'm glad that they're working. And I'm glad that there's, institutions out there that are willing to take the risk to offer these services. To wrap things up, I wanted to come back to that one point that we were making earlier about 280E, reducing the tax burden for cannabis businesses. The biggest issue with like starting up businesses is getting lending. I know SBA loans are off, but like now the fact that these businesses have more cash flow and are being taxed like a real normal business, that changes the landscape there because it wasn't, I know we talked about this in the prep interview. It wasn't because they were cannabis businesses they didn't get lending. It's just because they were not profitable businesses. As if you came in with, Brian's coffee shop not making any money. Sorry, you're just not getting a loan, sir. You have other problems to figure out.
I don't know if it's a myth, just education, more education is required. But yeah, I think that it's common to hear people say, "Well, I couldn't get, it's cannabis, so I couldn't get any financing," which is not necessarily untrue. However, there's a lot of details to unpack there. So, as you pointed out, if you're a startup and let's just say under 3 years old, you're probably not getting financing regardless. Now, outside of cannabis, the SBA is helpful. The Small Business Administration, they have programs that are generally viable for that scenario. It's just simply not available in cannabis. So it's simple as that. Let's say you make enough money, but your typical cannabis business has a very specific challenge. Your most valuable asset is arguably the license. Your second most valuable asset might be inventory, neither of which can be leaned. So honestly, it's simple as that, right?
Or unless you're lucky enough to own the building that you're in, lucky enough, depending upon your situation. Sometimes that's an albatross, sometimes it's an asset. But yeah, the banker doesn't want to hold on to boxes and boxes of vape cartridges.
and nor would you want to, really, right? Well, right now there's also the optics of like, oh, I see it's 100 pounds of something that's federally illegal. So no, we don't want to do that. But even when it is legal, right, when it is Schedule 3 or better for that matter, It's probably perishable items, right? Things like that. So it's close to, if you think about how the risk profile is comparable to, say, the restaurant business. Same thing, really. It's a cash business. There's no receivables. The business is entirely dependent on your ability to turn over inventory, turn over customers. The reality is, at any given time, so same thing with a restaurant, at any given time, you could have a restaurant that's killing it and simply not be killing it the next day. Just happens.
Yeah, yeah, just not making it there. You know, I know in lending in this industry, I know there's a few servicers that are supporting different items here, like Fontana is one, Lendica is another, but those are mainly geared toward inventory and inventory factoring. I mean, and I know actually some of them do have programs for like capital improvements and whatever else. Those are kind of the most reputable avenues for lending in this industry so far, and I hope things clear up with safer, safest, safer, or whatever else happens along with Schedule 3. Is that pretty much it right now? So like there might be, just from an actionable point of view, you're a new business, SBA is not an option for you. You're a new business. You're probably 3 years in, but you actually have to show profit to be able to get a loan for this industry. That's not precluded from you just because you are cannabis. It's precluded from you from the macro environment of the industry that we live in. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If you view it through the lens of what you and I just talked about, like, let's compare it to a comparable industry. Logically, we might continue to run parallel to that, to a restaurant type business for a long time. The reality is, the difference is more options. So keep in mind, most typical restaurant also cannot get bank financing for the same reasons. What's the collateral? There's no collateral. So what do restaurant businesses do? They're specialized lenders that provide a number of different type of lendings. So MCA, inventory, perhaps to some extent. There could be factoring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So some of the options that you mentioned, Fontana, Lendica, these are reputable sources that are actually doing loans. People have their gripes about it, but they work in a very specific way. And if that method works for you, it was the perfect answer. If that answer doesn't work for you, don't try to squeeze it into the box, right? Like, if you're going to sit there saying like, well, that makes no sense for me, well, then it makes no sense for you. Don't do it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then move along, and it might be a worse choice to say yes than not. So, and I'm sure there's a number of off-market lending options as well. Excellent, Peter. That's a great wrap up of banking. As we sit here in May 2024, audience, leave some comments, some questions. I'm sure there's a lot of follow-up here. Also, if you're in the New York area, Peter is around to every single event everywhere, all over the place, every single conference. You'll see him everywhere. I run into him randomly at conferences, not even, shooting a meetup, but there's Peter sitting there, hanging out, ready to answer your banking questions in a heartbeat. So I appreciate you being here. So, but leave the comments, because I do want to do a follow-up show as Schedule 3 items move along, and, any kind of banking regulations and updates and changes that come along with that. Peter's big on LinkedIn, by the way. Peter Su, SU, on LinkedIn. Find him. That's the best way to connect with him.
Yes. Please check me out, Peter Su on LinkedIn. Again, the one with all the letters.
Peter, I'm looking forward to having you back on. Audience, please list some comments and questions on here, but we'll have you back on, as the Schedule 3 stuff gets to reality, and see how that changes the banking landscape. But thanks for coming on here and sharing some wisdom with our audience.
Brian, thank you very much.